August 25, 1944, Honouliuli Internment and Prisoner of War Camp, Oahu, territory of Hawaii. The truck stopped at the lip of the gulch, and the heat rose from the red earth like breath from an oven, carrying the smell of cane, oil, and damp canvas. Petty Officer Second Class Kenji Takahashi climbed down with the others and blinked at the glare. He had been taken on Saipan in July, brought to Oahu under guard with a bandage still tight around his ribs, and he arrived with the single idea that America was a land of soft people who would not bear hardship for long. The gulch was deep and cut by a narrow stream, and beyond the wire he saw slim palms and a ribbon of the old railway, and beyond that he saw something he had not expected. A motor truck rolled past the outer fence, and a woman drove it, hair tied in a bright scarf, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Another woman stood in the bed of the truck steadying a crate. They waved at the soldiers at the gate and laughed as if work and heat and soldiers were everyday things. The women were not there to greet prisoners. They were simply on their way to a job, but the image held in Kenji's mind because it did not fit anything he had been taught. He had come from an army where women stood outside the barracks at a distance and passed food through a relative or a clerk, where wives lined up at ration offices while civil men checked lists and stamps. Here a woman leaned over a steering wheel and shouted to another to mind the corner, and the crate did not slip, and the truck moved on. In the registration tent, a corporal took Kenji's particulars, weighed him, and showed him a cot. At evening call, the loudspeaker carried an English message that was translated by a Nisei interpreter who had perfect schoolroom Japanese, and the interpreter explained the work rules and the Geneva protections and the pay for labor details. The interpreter also told them that farm and cannery work might begin soon because the harvest could not wait and the island needed hands. Kenji lay back on the cot with his hands behind his head and listened to the night. He thought of the sea at Tanapag, where he had been pulled from the water with a dozen others. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Aomori, where the rice jar had grown lighter month by month. And then he thought of a woman driving a truck through heat and dust and waving to soldiers as if she belonged among them, and he did not know what to make of that. America in late 1944 was not the land he had been trained to imagine. The national labor shortage was acute because more than 10 million men wore uniforms, so women entered paid work in numbers not seen before. By that summer, more than 18 million women held jobs, which meant that women made up more than a third of the civilian labor force. 6 million of those women were new to wage work since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The War Manpower Commission had pushed employers to hire them. Training centers taught welding, riveting, crane operation, and inspection. In aircraft manufacturing, the share of jobs held by women had gone from a small fraction before the war to more than a third by 1943 and higher still in 1944. The country celebrated the idea with posters that said, "We can do it," and films that showed strong arms and bright eyes on assembly lines. On the mainland, the Kaiser shipyards at Richmond turned out hundreds of ships, a total of hundreds upon hundreds over the course of the war, with a workforce that peaked near 93,000 and included many women as welders, burners, and crane tenders. In Michigan, the Willow Run plant spread across 2.5 million square feet, and at its peak in 1944 sent a B-24 Liberator bomber off the end of the line about once every 63 minutes. At New Orleans, the Higgins yards produced thousands of landing craft and put women to work in fabrication shops and on yards that ran day and night. In the old steel towns and the new aluminum centers, the story was the same. The numbers were vast. Millions of tons of steel moved, millions of shells pressed and loaded, millions of yards of cloth cut and sewn, and a quarter of the hands on those tasks were women. The government opened child care centers under the Lanham Act so that mothers could work shifts. The Navy accepted women into service as waves in 1942, and by 1945 there were more than 80,000 in uniform. The Army accepted women into the Women's Army Corps, and by 1945 there were more than 150,000. The Women Air Force Service pilots ferried aircraft, trained male pilots, towed targets, and freed men for combat flying. All these facts sat outside the fence at Honouliuli as surely as the gulch itself, and if Kenji could not yet see them, they were the country he had entered all the same. On his third morning, a sergeant called his number for a cannery detail at Iwilei, and he rode in a stake truck with 20 others, sitting on the planks with his heels pointed out. The road ran past sugar fields where cutters swung blades in practiced arcs, and it ran past low sheds where machines thumped and hissed. At the cannery, the prisoners waited by the gate while an officer signed papers, and in that half hour, Kenji had the first clear view of American women at industrial work. A line moved through a covered area like a river. The belt carried whole pineapples up to a row of cutters who snapped blades down and rolled halves into trays. The next belt carried the fruit to a bank of coring and slicing machines that chattered and sprayed sweet juice that made the air sharp and cloying at once. The floor was wet, the noise constant, and the rhythm exact. The cutters were local women, island-born, of many faces. Some were Japanese Americans, some were Filipino, some were Hawaiian, some were Portuguese, some were Chinese, some had pale faces and freckles. Hair was tied up in scarves and hats, eyes narrowed against the spray, and hands moved with speed and care together. A supervisor paced with a clipboard and stopped to lift a lid and check temperature, and then nodded and moved on. A girl no older than his sister leaned into the belt to clear a jam and laughed when the spray caught her cheek. A heavy machine hissed and exhaled steam. Near the loading dock, a woman as tall as a soldier stood on the running board of a truck and chalked a tally on a board. The scene was simple work, yet it was set on a scale that startled him. The belt did not stop. The machines did not pause to be admired. A siren sounded for a break, and the women stepped aside, and in the same second, cleaners in rubber boots stepped in with squeegees and hoses, and in 10 minutes the floor shone and the belt started again. The officer finished his signature, and the prisoners were led to a shed to load crates for rail, and Kenji bent his back to the work and still found his eyes pulled by the factory, where women directed movement with shouts and gestures. He had watched women cut fish in Aomori. He had watched women bind rice in the paddies near Hirosaki. He had seen women wash uniforms in a camp creek, but he had not seen women command machines in a web of belts and gauges on this kind of tempo. The difference burned in him because it was not one woman driving a truck or one woman sweeping a floor. It was a crowd of women who made the belt move and the crates fill and the trucks back to the dock at the right minute. The same pattern repeated across the United States in that season. Food canneries from California to New Jersey ran lines with thousands of women, many of them new to the work, taught to keep knives sharp and gauges safe and quotas met. In the big war plants, the numbers were even larger. At Richmond, the 4 shipyards called Yard 1 through Yard 4 launched a Liberty ship in a matter of weeks, and at one point, a special effort produced a ship in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. That record hull slid into the water to a crowd that filled the waterfront. The ship was the Robert E. Peary, and it became a symbol of speed. Yet the real story was repetition day after day. The yards there launched hundreds upon hundreds of vessels over the course of the war. A Kaiser yard on the Columbia River built escort carriers and sent them downriver past Vancouver to the Pacific. The workers wore badges that marked their trades. Women held the badges for welding, burning, layout, rigging, crane tending, and inspection. Tens of thousands of them learned to strike an arc, to read a weld for slag, to guide a hook to the right pad eye with a hand signal. In the aircraft factories at Long Beach, Inglewood, Seattle, Wichita, Buffalo, and Fort Worth, women fitted ribs and stringers, drilled and bucked rivets, checked tolerances, and signed inspection stamps that showed a woman's initials next to a part number that would fly. In 1943, the aircraft industry added more than 100,000 women in a single year. 1944. More than one-third of aircraft workers were women in many plants. Old photographs show rows of heads bent over wings and fuselages, and it is no trick of pictures. That was the daily life of the floor. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" had been spoken years before, and now the arsenal had a new face. The face had a scarf tied high to keep hair from the drill, and the smile lines around the eyes show in the few still moments captured on a lunch break stool. The nation did not simply allow women to do this. It counted on them. War bond drives featured women workers. Radio programs told stories about a rivet crew and a ship christening. Child care centers opened by the thousands under federal support so that women could report to swing shift. Wage boards and unions fought and argued over pay, and while women often earned less than men for the same job, they learned the skills and kept the places running as the numbers of men in uniform rose. All these things formed the backdrop to a prisoner standing under a palm and watching a belt carry fruit, locked behind a fence yet looking out at a country that ran on a rhythm he had not imagined. 2 weeks later, Kenji left the island. A guard detail marched a group to the pier at Honolulu Harbor, and they went aboard a gray freighter with a civilian crew. The island fell away as the ship nosed out to sea, and for the next days the horizon was empty by morning and full of stars by night. He kept track with a string knot for each day because he did not have a pencil, and when the Golden Gate came into view, the string had 8 knots. The ship eased past the long span. Tug whistles answered the harbor master. A man in a white cap waved from a launch and shouted something cheerful that Kenji could not hear. The ship tied up, and the prisoners were counted and taken down a gangway into trucks. The route around the bay carried them past yards and warehouses where shift whistles blew. By chance, the convoy rolled through Richmond as men and women came on and off shift, and he saw lines of people carrying lunch pails and wearing thick jackets against the cold bay wind. He saw the big, stiff cranes at the waterfront and the black ribs of a hull in a cradle and cables as thick as a man's wrist, and the high arc of a flame. It was dusk and lights burned bright on every yard. Red aircraft warning lights winked on the tips of long booms. A woman in a scarf stepped off a streetcar and hurried up the yard gate with a lunch pail, and beside her another woman quickened her step and matched her stride. And in that pair, Kenji thought he recognized the same ease and purpose he had seen in the island cannery. After processing at Fort Mason, they rode a train east and north with the shades drawn at night and open in the day, and the moving window showed warehouses, mills, and busy stations. In Oakland, he saw a group of women in navy blue uniforms waiting on a platform, and a young sailor tipped his hat to them and they laughed, and the train moved on. At Martinez, he saw tanks of oil and a tangle of tracks where cut after cut of freight cars were sorted by a small locomotive that shoved and braked and shoved again in a pattern that looked like a board game from his childhood. Beyond Sacramento, he saw orchards and the first of the wide fields. Near Reno, the train slowed for a long grade, and he saw stacks at a small plant and a row of women with bandanas tied high standing by carts. At every stop, Kenji watched what people wore and how they spoke to one another. And again he saw women with tool belts or lunch pails or clipboards, and he found that he was looking for them on purpose now, as if he could not believe what he had already seen. The prisoners ate from tin plates at their seats, and a guard poured coffee from a tall pot and called it out for anyone who wanted. The guard spoke to them in a slow English, as if it might be understood by care alone. A Nisei interpreter checked names and tried to teach a few words like morning, evening, and water, and the men tried the words and smiled when they found they could make the sounds. The scale of travel itself surprised Kenji. Trains rolled past in the other direction, with boxcars stenciled with names from states he had only read about. The yards were full in the night, lit like stadiums. In a Wisconsin dawn, they crossed a river on a high truss and came to a camp bounded by wire and pine. The sign said, "Camp McCoy," and the convoy turned through a gate, and the guards looked as tired as any guards look at dawn. In the first week there, he and others were assigned to the sugar beet fields under a contract arranged by the War Food Administration. Small towns took them in under guard to meet growers at dawn. The foreman on the first farm was a man in his 50s who shook the sergeant's hand and then nodded to the prisoners and made a simple gesture that meant, "Here is the row and here is the way to pull," and off they went. In the middle distance, a truck rattled past, and the driver was a woman with her hair in a kerchief and a small child beside her, and the woman looked steady on the seat. Her truck carried wooden crates and a shovel, and she had no time to stare at men in khaki as her day began, and she was a single figure in a landscape of work that made sense to itself. The field days in Wisconsin were a narrow view into a much larger picture. The United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners by late 1944, of which several thousand were Japanese. Most of the prisoners in the mainland were German, but thousands of Japanese were in camps in Hawaii and on the mainland as well. The army used prisoner labor for farm work and for tasks in canneries and mills that did not produce weapons. The total hours ran into the millions. That labor helped bring in harvests during a time when so many men were overseas. Yet even if a prisoner might touch a box or a sack, he could not touch the core of the system. The core was energy and machine rhythm, and a giant share of that rhythm was kept by women who had stepped into jobs with new purpose. The country added aircraft by the tens of thousands. It added tanks and trucks by the tens of thousands. Ammunition came in by the millions of rounds. When people speak of Liberty ships, they often name the famous record hull launched in less than 5 days. Yet the statistic that matters more is steady launch after steady launch from yards that employed men and women together, and the labor of women ran through those launches like a strong thread. Newspapers ran stories of mother and daughter teams on drill presses. Photographs showed a woman perched on a wing root with a rivet gun while a friend held a bucking bar inside the skin to catch each rivet, both of them smiling because the camera had arrived on break. Union rolls swelled with female names. Pay envelopes went home and bought war bonds and groceries and shoes for children. Child care centers took in toddlers so that mothers could make the morning bell. Colleges saw women in technical classes. Training schools in neighborhoods taught shop math and blueprint reading. Overhead in the home counties of aircraft plants, the WASP flew new planes to staging fields. Women at the controls of B-25s, P-47s, and C-47s, leaving contrails that crossed the sky like chalk lines on a blue slate. At rail platforms, women in navy blue uniforms spoke quietly, and shouldered canvas bags as they reported to duty in communications and supply. The habit of seeing women everywhere at work took hold. A soldier on leave became used to a woman selling tickets in a station, a woman guiding a crane in a freight yard, a woman with a stop flag on a road crew. The war had moved the pendulum in a way that the return of peace would not easily reverse. Kenji could not see the future from his place on a bunk in a barrack at Camp McCoy, but he could see the present very clearly. In the present, he saw a woman on a tractor with a canvas canopy rolling past rows of beets. He saw a woman with a brown lunch sack taking a 10-minute noon and walking back on time without looking up. He saw a woman step out of a small office by the scales at the beet dump with a pencil behind her ear and a pad in her hand, and she counted loads and called out weights to a man at the lever. He saw that the rhythm of this place did not pause to explain itself to prisoners. It only asked for the next hour of work, for a clean row, for a full sack, for a number written clear, for a belt to start when the whistle blew. At night he wrote in his head because he still had no paper, and he tried to fix these sights in order. The scarf, the lunch pail, the pencil behind an ear. He thought of his mother in Aomori and wondered what her day looked like now, and he thought of his sister in Sendai and whether she moved in step with women he had never imagined. And he lay still and listened to the murmur of men who had also watched and tried to square what they had seen with the world they had been told to expect. Kenji woke before réveillé on a morning when the first frost had silvered the grass around the beet dump, and the breath of the men rose like smoke in the half-light. He lay still and listened to the low conversation in the next bunk, where two Germans compared weights from the previous day and argued about whether the foreman's scale favored full sacks. The argument had the comfortable sound of habit. At the rail spur, a locomotive coughed to life, and the rattle of couplers carried across the yard. A corporal pushed the barrack door and called out the work party by number, and in a few minutes Kenji pulled on the canvas jacket that had grown stiff with dried mud. He walked with the others toward the trucks and saw the same woman at the scale house step out with a pencil behind her ear. She nodded once to the sergeant, and then to the foreman, and then to the men, and for a moment her eyes met his. The look held no curiosity and no fear. It was the look of someone who has too much to do to wonder very long about strangers. On the ride out, he kept his hands tight under his arms and watched fence lines go by, each post capped with a thin rim of white. The first rows were cold and hard, and the iron pulled rough through the crust until the sun rose and softened the top inch of soil. At mid-morning, a school bus painted dull green rattled past the edge of the field and stopped at a cluster of sheds. Children jumped down in coats and knit caps, and a woman in a dark sweater waved them toward a white building with a sign that read "Child Care," and then something he could not make out at that distance. Later, he learned that the government had set up these centers under the Lanham Act so that mothers could work shifts, and that there were thousands across the country by that year. In the afternoon, the woman at the scale house took over the truck for an hour while the regular driver fixed a tire. She swung the wheel with her left hand and used the other to signal as she backed to the platform and touched the bumper to the dock with a small thump. When the workday ended, the sergeant counted the sacks and the men and the money that would go on their camp accounts, and on the ride back, Kenji found that his mind had held the image of the child care sign as firmly as it held the image of the wheel in the woman's hand. His own mother had kept the house on the edge of Aomori without any public help, and his sister had left school to care for younger cousins when the ration office closed early. He knew the pride in that kind of management, but he also felt the shock of a system that arranged the hours of children so that women could keep the belts moving and the scales honest. That night, a Nisei interpreter told him that the county board had voted the childcare money by a clear margin because the crop must be pulled on time, and because the sugar quota had been set by Washington, and because rail cars would arrive on a schedule with no sympathy for weather or late sacks. The interpreter smiled when he said that last part. "The rail schedule is like a god in America," he said, and Kenji repeated the line to himself and decided that he believed it. Behind the view from a beat row stood a national structure that had grown very quickly. In the first 3 years of war, the federal government had financed more than 3,000 public child care centers through Lanham Act grants, and enrollment rose into the hundreds of thousands. The centers opened early and closed late to match shifts. Women entered paid work at a rate that changed the national picture. In 1944, about 18 million women held jobs, 6 million more than before Pearl Harbor. In some industries, women were the majority. In small arms assembly lines, women stood shoulder to shoulder and kept gauges within tolerances tight enough that barrels and bolts from different plants fit without handwork. In shipyards, women held more than a quarter of the jobs by late 1943 and rose higher in some shops by 1944. The Kaiser Yards at Richmond counted a workforce that reached near 93,000. And the yards launched hundreds of vessels over the course of the war as a matter of routine. The total of Liberty ships completed nationwide reached 2,710 by war's end, and many of those hulls had seams laid down by women who learned to strike an arc in 6 weeks and hold a bead on a vertical seam. In aircraft factories, women made up more than a third of production workers, and in some departments, the figure was above half. The Ford plant at Willow Run extended over 2.5 million square feet, and with subcontractors across the country, it turned over a stream of B-24 Liberators that reached one aircraft about every hour at peak. The women who bucked rivets and checked jigs in those plants were not curiosities. They were the regular face of the line, and their pay envelopes bought war bonds and groceries and rent and school clothes. In uniform, women served in the Women's Army Corps in numbers above 150,000 by 1945, in the Navy as waves in numbers above 80,000, in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve and the Coast Guard spars in thousands more. The women Air Force service pilots ferried planes from factories to fields and trained male pilots on new types. The number who earned silver wings as WASP was 1,074. In hospitals at home and on islands, nurses in Army and Navy service ran wards that filled and emptied with the pulse of campaigns in the Central Pacific and the European theater. When the president had spoken of an arsenal of democracy in 1940, he had not said who would hold the tools, but by 1944 a large share of those tools were in the hands of women, and the arsenal ran because they reported on time and stayed at stations and learned to repair gauges and hold a schedule that could survive the loss of a dozen men to the draft in a single week. In late October, the beat work slowed, and the camp officer read names for a new detail headed south. Kenji's number was on the list. The next day, a train of green coaches took them through Illinois under a lid of low cloud and along the Ohio River, where the water moved slow and gray past stacks and warehouses. At a junction, a group of women in navy blue uniforms boarded the next car. They carried canvas bags and wore black shoes that looked new. The men in Kenji's car sat quiet and watched through a crack where the door met the jamb. A guard looked back once and then shrugged and turned his head. At midnight, the train pulled into a yard near Evansville where light towers made the platforms bright as noon, and the prisoners came down under guard and climbed into trucks. The convoy crossed a bridge and stopped at a plant gate where a sign read Republic Aviation, and below that another line named the model under construction. In the darkness, the letters were hard to see, but in memory the name stayed. The work there was not directly war production, and the prisoners did not enter the buildings. They unloaded crates from flats and stacked them by number in a covered yard. Even at that distance, Kenji could see women on a walkway inside the building with aprons and badges and clipboards, and from time to time a door opened and a burst of machine noise spilled out, and then the door closed, and the walkway returned to silence above the hum. On a break, the sergeant pointed to a distant row of windows and said the night shift in there was mostly women. He spoke without surprise and without comment. Later that week, the detail moved to a small foundry to sweep and shovel and haul for a day. It was a world of heat and smoke and sparks and wool coats despite the heat. And the new sight there was a woman with thick leather gloves guiding a crane hook down to a rigging man. She stood at a pendant control and watched the load rise and then swung the hook clear as if she had been born with a line in her hand. When the load settled on the truck bed, she looked at the rigger, and he gave a small nod, and she gave a small nod back, and he stepped away, and the truck moved 5 feet and stopped for the next lift. At lunch, the prisoners sat on the curb by the yard wall, and a woman passed with a metal pail in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. She opened the paper to a page with a photograph of a girl in a scarf, smiling beside a sign that named a production award. And above the photograph, a headline invited the town to a war bond rally with a goal that seemed very large for a single day. Kenji could not read the words, but the number could be read in any language. The supervisor walked past and said to the guard that the last rally had beaten its goal and that the next would do the same. In the afternoon, a thunderstorm came up from the river and rattled the sheets of the shed where the prisoners stacked castings, and the women, under the walkway in the main building, did not stop. Not even when the power flickered once and the small lights above each station blinked and then held steady. The structure behind those local sites was built out of figures that historians would come to recite as proof of what the country had done. In 1944, American factories produced almost 100,000 aircraft, and more than 9,000 of those were heavy bombers. The number of tanks and self-propelled guns reached more than 17,000 for that year. The Army took delivery of trucks by the hundreds of thousands, from quarter-ton jeeps to heavy cargo tractors, and they moved on roads that had been built in the interwar years and improved under defense contracts. In the yards from Maine to the Gulf to Puget Sound, the total of ships laid down and launched in the emergency program ran into the thousands. Tugboats, patrol craft, destroyer escorts, attack transports, oilers, and the humble cargo vessels that fed the whole machine. Women were present in every one of those chains. In Alabama, at the Todd yards, women crewed plate shops and handled layout. In Portland and Vancouver, women ran cranes that lifted prefabricated sections into place. In Seattle, women at Boeing worked on B-17s and B-29s, while men were drafted and moved overseas. In Fort Worth, women at Consolidated and then Convair filled the central hangars with rows of jigs and workstands. In Long Beach and Inglewood, women at Douglas kept the lines for C-47s and A-20s moving. In Buffalo, women at Curtiss-Wright stood in cramped bays and drove rivets in wing roots. Newspapers printed photographs of these scenes by the thousands. One famous photographer captured a small woman with a scarf at a press with the caption that would be read and reread for generations. Yet for every staged picture, there were days that never became a caption. A mother caught a streetcar before dawn and changed to another line and stepped into a locker room with a whistle blowing, and she tied her hair back and checked in at a station and spent 8 hours on a jig that needed 3 hands and the patience of a pianist. And then she went home and fixed supper and helped a child with a spelling list and fell asleep with a book in her hand. It is an ordinary story, and it is the large story of that year. One retired welder told an interviewer many years later that the first time she struck an arc, she thought she had damaged the plate beyond repair, and an older woman in the booth next door said, "Let the pool flow and watch the edges." And she did, and the seam held in the test. Another woman recalled that the crane cab was the loneliest place in the yard until the first time she set a section square, and the fitters below gave her a thumbs up, and from that day it was her place. These are words that survive in the archives of shipyards and universities, and they speak a plain truth. Women filled jobs that required skill and attention and endurance, and they learned them on a schedule set by war and not by comfort. Kenji's next transfer brought him to a paper mill on the Mississippi, where the river bent and slowed and moved away from town with a wide brown face. The prisoners were hired out to sweep and load and to stack ties on a siding under the low trees. The town had a USO canteen on a corner near the depot, and women in white shirts and dark skirts carried trays of coffee and sandwiches to soldiers on leave. On a Sunday afternoon, the prisoners worked within sight of that corner, while a train paused at the platform and young men in khaki stepped down for an hour and laughed with girls who might have been their classmates the year before. A Navy petty officer in a white hat leaned on the railing and said something that made the girls laugh again. On the mill floor, women worked at tables where stacks of labels were checked and bundled. In a small office with glass walls, a woman sat at a typewriter and looked out at the floor between paragraphs, as if to rest her eyes, and then her fingers moved again, and the carriage rang at the end of a line. At the hospital a mile away, nurses moved between wards, where men from training accidents and farm injuries and winter fevers recovered under white sheets. A Red Cross poster in the window asked for blood, and the figure printed below the appeal was a schedule that shocked Kenji more than the sight of the needle. The next day, and the next day after that, and 3 days the week following. The appeal did not rest on a month or a season. It was a weekly habit. When he asked the interpreter whether all these schedules could really be kept, the young man said that people were very tired and kept them anyway. He added in a lower voice that when a year is long and full of worry, the only way through it is to hold to the hour at hand. "That is an American saying too," the interpreter said, and smiled a little, as if it were a private joke. At night in the barrack, a German who had worked in a Berlin print shop before the war said that his sister had once spoken at a women's club about the value of printing schedules for households, and the club had clapped and then gone home to the same small portion of coal and the same thin soup. He waved a hand at the wall and said that here the schedule was attached to real coal and real meat and a real train that arrived on time. It was a bitter kind of compliment, but it rested on the same observation that Kenji kept turning over like a small stone in his pocket. The women who printed the schedules and kept them were part of a system that moved things in quantity, and their part mattered because the quantities were so large. The national figures that stand behind that small corner in a river town are not easy to hold in a single thought, but they can be named. By the end of 1944, American industry had produced more than 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition in the war years, and millions of artillery shells and tens of millions of fuses and detonators. Women worked in the loading plants and inspection rooms of those facilities in large numbers. The Ordnance Department trained them to read micrometers and to check surface finishes under magnification, and a bad lot could be stopped because a woman at a bench flagged a measurement out of tolerance. In textiles, women produced millions of uniforms and blankets and tents that went to depots and then to ships and then to fronts where men slept dry or wet, depending in part on those tents. In food processing, women in canneries kept lines running that filled warehouses with cases of fruit, vegetables, and meat. The Army Quartermaster Corps accounted for shipments by the thousands of tons, and the figures for a single month could fill a page and look like an error to anyone who had not watched a belt run without stopping for 12 hours. In the services, women took on roles that freed men for jobs in combat units. In the Women's Army Corps, they worked in communications, administration, motor pools, and weather stations. In the Navy as waves, they worked in code rooms, schools, supply, and aviation maintenance. In the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard, they did the same in smaller numbers. In the skies, the women Air Force service pilots ferried aircraft from factory to field along routes that crossed the country like a net. And when a bomber or fighter arrived at a unit many miles away from the plant, there is a simple chance that the last person at the controls before the squadron pilot climbed in was a woman with a logbook that showed a neat hand and hundreds of hours in many types. When President Roosevelt spoke to the nation late in 1940, he said that the country must become the arsenal of democracy. And by 1944, that phrase had a face in every town. The face might be flushed with the heat of a press, or chapped by a winter wind at a yard gate. It might wear a scarf or a cap. It might be tired. It might be 20 years old and feel 40. It might be 40 years old and feel 20 because a skill mastered in weeks had opened a new part of life. The point is simple. The arsenal had millions of faces, and a great many of them were women. A prisoner who moved from a beet field to a siding to a mill could see this without being told, and once he had seen it, the sight could not be set aside like a postcard from a passing town. Kenji kept his own counsel in the barrack and did not attempt to instruct others. He had learned in Saipan that lectures are a poor shield. He folded his blanket with care each morning and kept his wooden spoon clean and his boots dry when he could. He watched and stored what he saw in the quiet place where a man keeps the thoughts that do not yet fit his old map of the world. One evening, the interpreter sat with him on the step and traded words for the names of tools in English and in Japanese. Plane, saw, gauge, level. The interpreter laughed when Kenji insisted on the exact difference between a river barge and a coastal lighter, and then supplied the phrases the way a teacher supplies a hungry student. Across the yard, a radio in the guard shack carried the low sound of a news voice reading casualty lists and unit locations. The voice was calm, and the lists were long. The interpreter said that a cousin had gone to the Navy and was now on a destroyer in the Pacific, and he had no way to write to him yet. He added without complaint that his father believed that service here behind the wire was service to the country too. And Kenji nodded, because he had learned that a man can love a country without needing to shout about it. The next morning, the town held a war bond rally on the square. The prisoners were at work on the siding a block away, and the sound of a brass band came over the sheds very clean in the cold air. A woman at the microphone thanked the crowd for meeting the last goal ahead of time and named a new number that made men whistle and clap. A girl no more than 12 sang the national anthem, and the square fell quiet for that minute. And then people put cash and bonds on a table and the band played again. In the afternoon, a woman from the USO came by the mill gate with a tray of coffee for the guards and a smaller tray that she handed to the sergeant for the prisoners. The cups were paper, and the coffee was thin and hot, and Kenji raised it in both hands and bowed a little, and the woman smiled and turned away toward the next group that needed coffee. He thought again how the small motions that kept a place running were often done by women who did not look up for thanks, because the next motion had already called them. That night, as he lay in the narrow light from the walkway lamp, he thought of the woman at the beat scale, the woman at the crane pendant, the women on the walkway in the aircraft plant, the woman with the pencil behind her ear, the women on the streetcar. the women in navy blue uniforms with canvas bags. The images had begun as surprises. They had become the normal scenes of his days. He found that they had also become a story that tied the places together. The story was simple. The country moved because women kept time with the machines and the schedules and the trains and the scales. He closed his eyes and saw again the motion of a hand at a crane control and the way a hook settles when it is guided by a steady eye and a steady hand. And he thought that steadiness was the core of what he had been watching all along. Kenji's third month in captivity began with snow. It fell silently overnight across the camp at the edge of the Mississippi River, coating the tar paper roofs and the narrow yard between the barracks in a sheet of cold white. The air smelled of pine smoke from the stovepipes, and the only sound before dawn came from the freight yard beyond the tracks, where a switcher engine rolled cars one at a time along the siding. Kenji stood at the potbelly stove in the barrack warming his hands and watched frost gather at the window corners. The routine had grown familiar. Work details were assigned by clipboard at dawn. Guards stood ready with rifles across their chests, and trucks waited by the mess hall to carry the prisoners to local farms, mills, construction sites, and canning plants. When his number was called for a local timber yard that morning, he thought little of it. Wood was wood, and labor was labor. But what he found at that mill would deepen the picture now forming in his mind. It would also bring him closer to something he had not expected to encounter on American soil. Resolve. Not the thin resolve in propaganda posters, not the brittle strength of speeches, but the quiet and relentless kind carried by people who did their duty without fanfare. At the timber yard, a line of women stood at sawhorses trimming boards to standard lengths with handsaws and small table saws. They wore heavy gloves and wool caps and canvas aprons tied at the waist, the same gear worn by the men. A woman with hair the color of rust tucked under her hat lifted boards from a stack taller than herself, tested each one against a square, trimmed the end if needed, and sent it down the line. The saw rasped and the cut fell. Another woman checked the markings and stacked the finished boards on a pallet. Behind them, the big saws roared, reducing whole logs to planks with a steady grind that shook the earth. Kenji stood by a pile of offcuts and fed the furnace that powered the mill. He worked with a rhythm he had learned by watching two older prisoners, both carpenters before the war, and he kept half an eye on the trimming tables. The motion was the same every day. Lift, check, cut, stack. Yet what caught his attention was not the work. It was the discipline. The women did not waste a gesture. They did not tire early. They did not gossip or complain. They spoke only when needed, short and simple words that served a purpose. Board short by a thumb length. Check warp. New blade at noon. He had been trained to believe that industrial discipline belonged only to militarized peoples. Yet here it was in the hands of mill workers in a small American town. They worked as if the fate of a front depended on exact measurements and square ends. Later, he learned from the interpreter that the timber was going to a small factory that produced crates for shell casings. The shells would travel by rail to a port. They would cross an ocean. Some of them might be fired in the Pacific against Japanese positions. He had cut and stacked fuel to support the making of crates that would hold shells that might kill men he once commanded. Yet the war felt distant and unreal in that moment. The immediate truth lay in the sweat on his brow and the strong arms of the women who trimmed boards with a precision that left no doubt. America was not fighting only with soldiers. It was fighting with factories, fields, railroads, canneries, shipyards, and timber mills. And women were inside each of those places making the machine move. The scale of that machine was hard to grasp from a single yard or a single day, but the facts were written in the endless reports that passed through Washington and filtered down to every town. By the end of 1944, the United States had built more ships than any nation in history. More than 5,000 naval vessels of all types had been launched since the start of the war, along with thousands of merchant ships. Women took part in the construction of nearly every one of them. In the inland river yards along the Ohio and Mississippi, women welded the hulls of tugboats and barges that pushed grain, coal, and oil. On the Great Lakes, they labored in yards that produced freighters and patrol craft. On both coasts, they manned plate shops and machine stations in the famous emergency yards. In Richmond Yard 1, a team of women welders known informally as the B Crew handled night shift repairs. In South Portland, Maine, a pair of sisters became skilled crane operators who often set prefabricated sections faster than any other team. On the Puget Sound, women rolled steel plate with the same steady hands they used to roll pie dough at home, though they smiled at the comparison because they knew the truth. There was nothing delicate about steel work. At Willow Run, the plant consumed aluminum by the trainload. More than 200 freight cars arrived each day loaded with parts and materials. Women unloaded crates, drove tow motors, and kept the lines supplied. The figures were staggering. In a single year, the plant produced 5,000 bombers. That meant nearly 14 aircraft per day. Each required more than 1,200,000 parts. Every bolt carried a number. Every panel carried a mark. And in the log books on the floor, names and initials of women appeared as inspectors and fitters. On the East Coast, at the massive Springfield Armory, thousands of women assembled M1 rifles with the same skill as any armorer. They checked headspace, timing, and chamber finish. They measured tolerances with feeler gauges. They loaded barrels onto racks that seemed to stretch the length of a city block. The rifles went to infantry divisions that would fight through the hedgerows of France and across the fields of Belgium. One rifle might go to a man who would never know that the last person to hold it before him was a woman wearing goggles and an apron. In Detroit, where tank and truck production became a force of nature, women clocked in at the old automobile plants now converted to war. They assembled engines, wired harnesses, tested radiators, and turned wrenches. The arsenal of democracy was not a figure of speech. It was a living system that ran on the hands of millions. And as Kenji watched the women at the timber yard push through a bitter wind to finish that day's quota, he felt something that unsettled him. Respect. He had seen American firepower. He had tasted American food. But this was different. This was the quiet backbone of a nation that refused to slow its machines. A nation that believed work was victory. A nation that did not wait for men to return from war, but filled the empty stations with women who learned fast and endured without complaint. In January, a new notice went up on the camp bulletin board. Volunteers were needed for an agricultural project in Minnesota. Sugar beet quotas had to be met for the coming year, and the War Food Administration had struck a deal with local authorities. Prison labor would fill the gap left by enlistments. Kenji added his name to the list. He did not seek the work out of loyalty to the camp or goodwill toward the Americans. He wanted to keep moving. Movement meant new places. New places meant new answers to the question that had begun to form in his mind. How could a nation that sent so many men overseas maintain such a vast economy at home? He did not yet understand the full scale of it, but he sensed the answer had something to do with the women he kept seeing in the most unexpected places. The train north passed through towns that looked small on any map, and yet showed signs of industrial force in every yard. Small depots held stacks of crates marked for plants in Ohio and Michigan. Grain elevators stood like monuments beside the tracks. Sawmills and flour mills lined the rivers. Every town seemed tied into a web of commerce and production that reached both coasts. When they reached Minnesota, the ground lay under a blanket of snow 2 feet deep. Wind cut through wool and canvas. The men were housed in a small camp near a beet refinery, where the smell of sugar filled the air. The refinery itself looked like a fortress of concrete and steel. It stood 5 stories high with stacks that sent white vapor into the sky. Women came and went by foot and by truck at every shift change. Some worked on the factory floor, sorting beets and feeding hoppers. Others worked in the lab testing sugar purity. Still others managed the clerical work in offices that bustled with activity. Kenji learned that the refinery produced hundreds of tons of sugar per day at peak season. Much of it went to army contracts. Sugar was vital to canned goods, rations, and medical supplies. The War Production Board ranked it as a strategic material. In Japan, sugar had been rationed heavily since 1942. Here it moved by the ton on conveyors that never stopped. Standing near the loading dock one evening, Kenji watched a woman climb a metal ladder to check a gauge on a tank. She wore heavy boots and a thick coat and carried a clipboard. When she reached the platform, she stamped her feet against the cold and then bent over the gauge with a flashlight. She wrote down the reading, tapped the gauge once to check for a stuck needle, and wrote again. Then she climbed down and disappeared into the noise and steam of the refinery. Her movements were simple, yet they revealed a truth he could not shake. She knew that gauge. She knew why it mattered. Her confidence was not borrowed. It was earned by doing that job every day. She was one of millions who had stepped out of traditional roles and into the heart of the nation's most vital work. Whether she knew it or not, she carried the war on her shoulders as much as any soldier.